My name is Alex Edmonson. I'm a chef here in Calgary, and we're in the Dominion kitchen in Bridgeland, showing off what we can do in here. We're gonna cook a little surf and turf, but first, a little bit about me. I'm a private chef here in Calgary. I do mostly dinner parties. Worked all over the world, and I was just recently on Top Chef Canada, but I'm back here in Calgary cooking up food for you. So let's get going. So the dish we're making today is a surf and turf. We got some lovely strip loin from the Bridgeland Market, just down the street. Some lobster, nice Atlantic Coast lobster. I like the smaller guys. They're a little bit sweeter. We're gonna have some organic blackberries, a little bit of vermouth vinaigrette, lots of mustard, tarragon, really herbaceous. It's a little bit lighter than your traditional surf and turf. A few things you need to make this recipe. You need a jar, a piping bag, optional, but it does help. Resting rack, also optional, but it does help. Maybe some scissors, and really important, we need some skewers for our lobster, and I'll show you what those are for later. So we got our steak here. We want to get this open right away, just kind of get some oxygen. It's called blooming. It'll help the steak kind of open up, and then we can season it. I like to season my steak a little bit earlier, but hold off on the pepper. You don't want to put the pepper on right away because it will burn. So just give this guy a nice generous seasoning. You can do this recipe with a strip loin, ribeye, tenderloin, whatever the Bridgeland Market is carrying, just use it. This dish is all about the details. So we have creme fraiche, we have tarragon powder that I've dehydrated myself, but you could also use just the powdered tarragon. We got garlic, some dill for garnish. Our vinaigrette is gonna be made with vermouth vinegar. It's just a little bit higher end red wine vinegar. I like to use, instead of just the traditional red wine, a little bit funkier. You can use port vinegar, vermouth vinegar, Cabernet vinegar is really good too. For the lobster though, we wanna get it out of the shell. We're not gonna cook it in the shell. The way I like to do it is kind of just sit on its side, fold over your paper towel, and give it a good squish. This will kind of break the shell up, and then you can go back the other way and open it up. And this method is good because you don't damage the meat at all. You kind of just gently pull out your lobster meat. So we have our whole lobster tail. It's pretty small. Like I said though, this is a bit sweeter, a little bit more tender. So now that our lobster's out of the shell, we're gonna take a skewer. We're gonna skewer the meat, and this is gonna keep it from folding up when it cooks, because naturally the lobster tail is gonna wanna fold up like this, like a shrimp. We don't want that, especially for the presentation, so we're just gonna stick a skewer up its butt. Nice and gentle. Try and get it in the dead center. That's good to go. So when we cook it, it's gonna remain flat like that. It's not gonna curl up, and it's actually gonna help tenderize it a bit because you're kind of piercing the meat when you go through. And just like our steak, we're gonna season it, and we'll let that sit for a few minutes. Next up, we've got our vinaigrette. So this is what our can is for, or a jar. You're never gonna have to buy vinaigrette ever again from the store. I'm gonna show you how easy this is. So open up your jar. This is I think a 250 milliliter jar. We're gonna get 1 part vinegar, 2 parts oil, and we're gonna emulsify it with some mustard. This recipe, we're gonna use a pretty generous amount of mustard because it helps emulsify the vinaigrette. But you can just kind of eyeball this. It's gonna be about a 1/4 cup of vinegar. A little bit of oil. I like to use neutral oil like grapeseed oil, canola oil, avocado oil. This is what I'm using today. Always season your vinaigrettes. A little bit of salt. We've got an acidic component, we've got salt now, we've got our fat from the oil, and now we need a little bit of sweetness, so I'm just gonna add a splash of maple syrup to balance it all out. And our mustard. I'm going a pretty generous amount of Dijon here. It'll go really well with the steak and the lobster, but also helps emulsify the vinaigrette. A little bit of pepper. And then just seal it up and give it a good shake. Next, we're gonna do some marinated or macerated blackberries. This is kind of the twist on the dish. So this is gonna add a little bit more sweetness, a little bit of acidity from the tartness of the berry. But we're gonna make use our vinaigrette for our macerated blackberries. We're just gonna cut them in half and then kind of let it marinate in this. And that will be one of the garnishes for our dish. I've got organic blackberries here. Just make sure they're all good. None of them are moldy or too soft. And we wanna cut all of them in half. So grab our bowl. We're gonna toss these guys in here, and then we're just gonna let them kind of sit and marinate in our vinaigrette. So we'll add some of that vinaigrette here. Give that a good stir and a toss so they're evenly coated. A little bit of the pieces of blackberry will break off into the vinaigrette. You actually want that. It'll add some of the sweetness and more depth to the flavor. So next we're gonna cook our lobster nice and low and slow. We wanna cook the lobster before the steak. We're gonna bring it up really slowly in just some brown butter. Brown butter basically is butter that's been caramelized. So you boil the butter until the milk solids start to almost, well, caramelize. You wanna take it off before it burns because it does burn quite easily, and then you strain it off and you have this nice, nutty, caramelized butter. It just adds a little bit more depth again. And like I said earlier, this dish is about the details. So adding, complexity of flavor where you can really helps. So we're just gonna add a layer of brown butter at the bottom here. And we'll let this melt. You can also use plain butter for this, whole butter, just make sure it's unsalted because you don't want to oversalt your dish. You could also use ghee, that works really good too. Ghee and brown butter are very similar, where they have a really high burning point because the milk solids have been removed from this, and it just remains that little caramel flavor from the caramelization. They're not going to smoke and burn as fast as like a regular butter. Next, we're going to add our lobster directly to the pan. Just turn it down to low. Keep that pan as low as you can. And we're just going to slowly bring it up to temp. While that's simmering away here, we're going to make our tarragon creme fraiche. So we've got creme fraiche. You can make yourself. It's just a cup of cream, a tablespoon of buttermilk, a little bit of lime zest if you'd like, and then you just let it sit on the counter with covered for about 48 hours. And then the culture starts to really activate and it thickens the cream. So I bought both dried tarragon and fresh tarragon. We're gonna add the fresh tarragon to the creme fraiche. The dried tarragon will be for the end garnish. Tarragon is quite licoricey and intense, so you don't need a lot. And the stem is really thick. It's not edible. Make sure you take off the leaves. We'll probably only need about a teaspoon of chopped tarragon for every quarter cup of creme fraiche. Chop your herbs as fine as you can. You don't want big chunks of tarragon in this. You can also use the dried tarragon straight up if it's easier for you, but make sure you use half the amount. You only want to use half a teaspoon because dried will be more intense. We're gonna add this to our piping bag that we had from earlier. This is just kind of help with presentation. This is the optional part. You could also just use it as a garnish, but I'm gonna pipe it on to the dish. For a piping bag, if you're piping anything, just get your fingers around the top and give it a good swing. That'll get everything to the bottom. And then you can tie it so nothing leaks. Actually, at this point, we can flip our lobster. If you're finding your lobster is boiling or searing too hard, just push it off to the side. Next, we'll start with our steak. We're gonna butter baste it again with some aromatics. So we've got some of that tarragon still. We can use a little bit of that. We've got some shallots, some garlic, and of course our brown butter. You can also use whole butter for this as well. For the garlic, I'm just gonna cut the top off to expose all the cloves. And for the shallot, cut it in half. Same with the garlic. If there's any flaky skin, try to get all that off because it is quite bitter. We're going to turn our pan on. to the highest setting. If your steak has a little bit of juice on the top, you might just want to tap it off or pat it off. That way there's no splatter when you put it into your pan. If your lobster is looking done, you can kind of test it with your hand. If it's nice and firm, you can take it off the heat. When searing steak, you're gonna put it into the pan gently, away from you. You don't want any of that oil splashing at you. If you don't hear that sizzle, take it out right away. It's not hot enough. We're not gonna add our aromatics until the steak is flipped. So just have those ready to go. A big spoon helps to sear. This will be for butter basting and getting all the aromatics onto the actual meat. And when searing steak on the pan in your house, depending on the thickness, it's usually about 3 minutes aside for a good medium rare. If you want it more done or less, obviously change the time. For a rare, it's about 2 minutes aside. For a medium, it's about 4 minutes aside. Kind of just check every so often how your steak is, just really lifting it up. If you find it's getting too dark, you can turn it down. So before I flip it, I'm actually just gonna lean it onto its fat cap here. Just kind of render that out. This is really only strip loin specific. I'm gonna turn it down to a medium heat now at this point. Once it's fully flipped, you can add your garlic, your shallots, your herbs. Thyme looks really good too. And our butter. And then you start the basting process for a few minutes. Put those herbs right on top of the steak. Okay, turn it off after your time has gone up. This is where our resting rack comes into play. Take your steak and your aromatics out of the pan. Now that our steak is cooked and we don't have to cook it anymore, we can add our pepper. It's not going to burn at this point. And we can take our lobster out of our butter as well. Just remove the skewers from the lobster. Because it's cooked, it will maintain its shape. So our steak has been resting. We had all these beautiful aromatics that are included in it. You can actually keep those and save those. So we've got almost like a fried tarragon leaf here. Really good. We've got our roasted garlic and some roasted shallots. All taste beautiful and will work really good. We've got our creme fraiche here, which we can cut open. So we can cut into our steak here. I like to add just a pinch more salt to the center of the steak because we seasoned the outside. I like just to add a little bit more to the center. We've got our plate here. So we can grab a nice piece of steak. Our lobster tail. A little bit of our blackberries. Creme fraiche. Nice little dollop of that. Tarragon powder. And I'm going to actually add some of our aromatics from our pan. I'm actually going to add a little bit of our mustard vinaigrette too, just for some acidity. All right. Surf and turf with a tarragon creme fraiche, a little bit of mustard vinaigrette, strip loin steak, and lobster. And now here we have our surf and turf.